In the driest place on earth, there is a city where a person can be born, grow up, grow old, and die without ever once feeling rain on their skin. Not a drizzle, not a passing shower. Nothing. For generations, the sky over the Atacama has been an empty blue certainty, a promise so reliable that the people beneath it stop thinking of rain as a thing that could happen to them at all. They built their homes in the dry ravines because the ravines were flat and convenient and had been bone dry for as long as anyone could remember. They built their towns across the mouths of the canyons, on the smooth aprons of old gravel that fanned out from the mountains, because that gravel was the easiest ground to build on, and the water that had once shaped it was ancient history. Gone for centuries, impossible, they built, in other words, directly in the path of the water, precisely because they were certain the water would never come. And now the water is coming. It is falling from a sky that was never supposed to open, in quantities these places have not seen in living memory or in any memory at all, and it is finding the paths it carved long ago. The ravines and the canyon mouths and the gravel fans, and it is following them down, through the streets and the homes that people built in the dry bed of a river that has decided, after all this time, to flow again. There is a man named Rodrigo, and though he could be from any of these cities, picture him in one of the mining ports strung along the northern coast, a place hemmed between the Pacific and the steep brown hills that climb toward the desert plateau. He has lived there his whole life, more than 50 years, and in all that time he can count on one hand the occasions he has seen real rain, and even those were slight, a strange wetting of the dust that people came out of their houses to watch. His neighborhood, like so many in these cities, climbs up the lower slopes of the hills and spreads across the mouth of a quebrada, one of the steep, dry ravines that score the land above the town, a ravine that has been dry his entire life, dry his parents' entire lives, a place children play in and people dump old furniture, and no one has ever thought of as a river, because it has never held water. That ravine is why he is in danger, though for most of his life it looked like nothing at all, just a dry gully behind the houses. Because a quebrada is not a gully. It is a river that is simply waiting, a channel carved by water over ages, empty now, but perfectly shaped to carry a flood the day one comes. Aimed like a chute straight down through the neighborhood that grew up around its mouth. Rodrigo does not think of it that way, because nothing in his experience has taught him to. He thinks of it as the dry ravine behind his house. And that gap between what the ravine actually is and what a lifetime of drought has trained him to believe it is the exact space in which this disaster lives. Repeated in the minds of hundreds of thousands of people across the driest desert on earth, all of them living beside sleeping rivers they have been taught to see as safe. This is a story about the most counterintuitive disaster on the planet, the drowning of the desert, the burial of cities by mud in a land defined by the total absence of rain. And it is a story about a specific and terrible kind of vulnerability, the vulnerability of the utterly unprepared, because the places being buried are not merely unlucky. They are places whose entire existence was built on the assumption that this could never happen, whose streets and homes and drains and habits were all shaped by a certainty that has just been broken. A city that expects rain builds for it, slopes its streets, digs its channels, keeps its people out of the floodways. A city that has never seen rain does none of these things, because why would it prepare for something that does not exist? And so when the rain finally comes to the driest place on earth, it does not arrive as an inconvenience to be managed. It arrives as an apocalypse to a people who never imagined it, sweeping through the exact places they built in the false safety of a sky they trusted completely, and the very dryness that defined their home, becomes the thing that makes the water so deadly. To understand why, you have to understand just how dry the Atacama truly is, because its dryness is not like the dryness of other deserts. It is a dryness so extreme it belongs almost to another planet. Across much of the Atacama, the average rainfall is measured in a very small number of millimeters per year, a fraction of an inch, and in some places the long-term average approaches zero. There are weather stations in the heart of the desert that have recorded no meaningful rainfall for years on end. There are places where the ground has apparently not been significantly wetted by rain for extraordinarily long stretches of time, where the soil chemistry itself resembles the surface of Mars, where scientists test their instruments precisely because it is the closest thing on Earth to another world. This is not a dry place. It is the dry place, the benchmark against which all other dryness is measured, a desert so absolute that in some corners life, as we normally know it, barely registers. And people live there, in real cities, hundreds of thousands of them, because the Atacama is also rich in copper and minerals and the industry of extracting them, so that around the mines have grown real settlements, ports, towns, cities with schools and hospitals and neighborhoods, all of them perched in a landscape that is, by any normal measure, one of the most hostile on the planet, and all of them built on the foundational assumption that the defining feature of that landscape, its bottomless dryness, would hold. The reason the Atacama is so dry is a combination of forces that all point the same way. And understanding them explains why rain there is so rare and, when it comes, so shocking. To the east rise the Andes, an enormous wall of mountains that wrings the moisture out of air coming from that direction, leaving the desert in a profound rain shadow. To the west lies the Pacific, but a cold current runs along that coast, chilling the air above it so that it does not readily rise and form rain, capping the region under stable, dry conditions. And overhead sits a persistent zone of high pressure, the kind of descending, drying air that produces deserts across the subtropics, holding the sky clear and the rain away. Everything about the Atacama's position on the planet conspires to keep it dry. A near-perfect machine for the exclusion of rain, and for a very long time that machine has worked with such reliability that the absence of rain became the single most dependable fact of life there. But the machine is not absolute, and it is not immune to change, and when the conditions that normally keep the rain away are disrupted, when moisture finds a way and past the mountains, or the high pressure weakens, or a system pushes through from an unusual direction, the desert can receive, in a single day, more rain than it normally sees in years. And that is where the catastrophe begins. Because the thing about a place that never sees rain is that it is utterly unequipped at every level to deal with water. Start with the ground itself. In a wetter climate, soil is soft, root-bound, porous, able to soak up rainfall like a sponge, and it is held together and slowed down by a living skin of vegetation, grass and roots and leaf litter that break the fall of the rain and drink it in and hold the soil in place. The Atacama has almost none of this. Its surface, in many places, is a hard, sun-baked crust, a pavement of stone and salt and compacted mineral that has not known moisture for so long that it sheds water almost like a roof, letting it run off rather than soak in. And there is virtually no vegetation, no roots to hold the soil, no ground cover to slow the flow. Nothing but bare mineral slopes and loose gravel and the accumulated debris of ages sitting on the hillsides. So when the rare heavy rain falls, the ground does not absorb it. It repels it. The water sheets off the hard surfaces and gathers in the low places, running fast and unimpeded down slopes that offer no resistance, concentrating with astonishing speed into the natural drainage lines. The very ravines and canyons and dry riverbeds that thread through the desert and, all too often, through the cities built in it. In a matter of minutes, a rain the desert has not seen in a decade becomes a flood roaring down channels that have been dry for a generation. And then the flood becomes something worse than a flood, something the dryness itself creates, and this is the heart of the horror. As the water rushes down those bare slopes and dry channels, it does not stay clean water. It picks up the loose material that has accumulated over the long dry ages, the sand and gravel and stones and boulders and dust that no vegetation was holding in place. And it takes all of it along, more and more as it goes, until the flow is no longer water carrying some debris, but something else entirely. A dense, churning slurry of mud and rock, a moving mass with the consistency of wet concrete and the momentum of a landslide. This is the alluvion, the debris flow, the true killer of the Atacama, and it is far more destructive than water alone could ever be. Water flows around obstacles. A debris flow, thick with rock and mud, hits them like a wall, a battering surge dense enough to carry boulders the size of cars, to shove buildings off their foundations, to bury streets and homes under meters of muck that sets, afterward, almost as hard as the stone it came from. It moves fast, faster than a person can run. Coming down out of the mountains through the canyon mouths with a roar, and it arrives often with little warning, because the rain that spawned it may have fallen high in the mountains, out of sight of the city that lies below in what was, an hour before, a clear and rainless day. The dryness that stripped the slopes bare and left the loose debris unbound is the very thing that turns the rare rain into this monster of mud, so that the desert's defining quality, its aridity, is precisely what makes its floods so uniquely deadly. It is worth slowing down to feel what that flow is actually like when it arrives, because the word mudslide is far too gentle for it. It does not ooze or creep. It comes down the quebrada as a moving front, a leading wall of the thickest, heaviest material shoving ahead of the flow, sometimes several feet high, sometimes much more, a churning ridge of mud and rock and whatever it has already torn loose, advancing at the speed of a car. Inside the flow, boulders that weigh as much as vehicles are carried along as if they were pebbles, rolling and grinding at the bottom, and the whole mass gives off a sound people never forget, a deep grinding roar of rock on rock beneath the wet slap of the mud, audible before the flow itself comes into view. When it reaches the built-up ground, it does not flow around the houses the way water would. It hits them. The front strikes a wall with the force of a slow avalanche, and the wall either holds or, more often, does not, and the flow pours into and through the structure, filling rooms with mud in seconds, shoving furniture and people and cars along with it, prying buildings off their foundations, stacking vehicles like debris against whatever finally stops them. And it does not drain away cleanly when the rain stops. The water seeps out and leaves the solids behind, so that a neighborhood the flow has passed through is left buried under a thick, heavy layer of mud and stone that begins, almost at once, to dry and harden in the desert air, entombing everything it covered, so that the aftermath is less like a flood receding and more like a city being slowly cast and set in concrete. That is what comes down the sleeping ravine when the rain finally falls, and that is why a rain the desert barely notices in quantity can be so utterly catastrophic in effect. Now place a city in the path of that, and you have the disaster that is unfolding. The settlements of the Atacama were not laid out by people anticipating debris flows, because those people had never seen one and could not imagine one. They were laid out by people seeking flat, buildable ground in a rugged desert, and the flattest, most inviting ground was often exactly the wrong ground. The floors of the dry ravines, the smooth alluvial fans at the canyon mouths, the old channels of rivers that had not run in living memory. These are the natural pathways of the water, the places the debris flows go, chosen by the geology over thousands of years, and the city settled onto them precisely because the dryness had made them look safe. A dry ravine is just a convenient low road. A dry riverbed is just a flat place to build. An alluvial fan is just a gentle slope of easy ground. Until the day the water returns to claim the paths it made, and finds them full of homes. When the rare rain comes and the debris flow roars down out of the mountains, it does not carve a new path. It follows the old one, the one the city was built on, straight through the neighborhoods that occupy the ancient floodway, and it buries them because they were built unknowingly in the one place the water was always going to go if it ever came back. This is not a hypothetical, and it is not new, though it is growing worse. The cities of northern Chile have been struck by these desert deluges before, and each time the pattern is the same. A rare storm, a sudden flood, a wall of mud coming down through a city that had no reason to expect it. There was a catastrophe decades ago when a major coastal city in the region was hit by mud flows that came down the canyons behind it and tore through its streets, killing many and burying parts of the city in debris, a disaster that should have been a permanent warning. There was a much larger event about a decade ago when a storm dropped years' worth of rain in a single day across the Atacama, and rivers that had been essentially dry for many years, one of them dry for the better part of 2 decades, roared back to life, overflowing through cities that had all but forgotten the water existed, killing around 24 people, displacing many thousands, and causing damage measured in the billions, the mud rising through homes and businesses and coating whole neighborhoods in a thick, drying sludge. And it is happening again now, in this very period, as heavy rains have struck the desert regions of northern Chile, and the authorities have declared states of catastrophe as mud flows have cut through towns. As tens of thousands of people have been cut off, as the driest place on earth once again finds itself fighting the water it was built to never expect. Each event is treated, in the moment, as a freak, an anomaly, a 100-year storm. But they are coming closer together, and that changes everything about what they mean. And the single statistic that captures the whole horror is the one about how much rain it takes. In these events, the desert has received, in the span of a single day, more rain than it normally sees across several years. In some cases, the equivalent of a decade or more of its meager average falling in a matter of hours. To a wet climate, a day like that would be a memorable storm. To the Atacama, it is an amount of water the landscape has no idea what to do with, arriving all at once onto ground that cannot absorb a fraction of it, in a place with no capacity to store or channel or survive it. The mismatch between the trivial-sounding rainfall totals, an inch or two, and the catastrophic results, whole neighborhoods buried, is the thing outsiders struggle to grasp. And it is entirely a function of where it falls. The same rain that would barely close a school in a temperate city can flatten a district in the Atacama, not because the rain is greater, but because the place is so utterly unmade for it, so absolutely a creature of dryness, that even a modest gift of water becomes a weapon. Because the deeper story here is not simply that the desert sometimes floods. It is that the rare is becoming less rare, that the machine which kept the Atacama dry is being disturbed, and that the disturbance points back to the broad changes reshaping the planet's climate. A warming world is a world of altered atmospheric circulation, of moisture moving in new patterns, of the old reliable boundaries between wet and dry growing less reliable. Systems that once would have stayed away are finding their way to the desert more often, pockets of unstable air that break off from the normal flow and drift over regions that rarely see them, dropping their moisture where it is least expected. Warming also lifts the level at which precipitation falls as rain rather than snow, so that storms which might once have dusted the high Andes with snow, releasing their water slowly, instead dump it as rain that runs off immediately, swelling the floods. And the periodic warming of the Pacific that reshapes weather across South America can push moisture toward these coasts in ways that load the dice toward exactly these events. No single storm can be pinned with certainty on climate change, and honesty requires saying so. But the pattern, the trend, the growing frequency of catastrophic rain, in a place defined by its absence, fits precisely what a disrupted climate would produce. And it means that the desert deluges are not a series of unrelated freak events, but the leading edge of a shift. The dry place learning to be episodically, violently wet, and doing so faster than the cities built on its dryness can possibly adapt. And that inability to adapt is the cruelest part, because these cities are trapped by their own history. A place that has always dealt with rain has, over centuries, developed defenses so ordinary that its people barely notice them: storm drains beneath the streets, gutters along the roofs, channels to carry floodwater away, building codes that keep homes out of the floodways. An entire invisible infrastructure of water management woven into the fabric of the city and the habits of its people. The cities of the Atacama have almost none of this, because for their entire existence there was no water to manage. Their streets have no meaningful drainage, because drainage would have been an absurd expense for rain that never fell. Their neighborhoods sit in the floodways, because the floodways never flooded. Their people have no reflex for rain, no instinct to move to high ground, no memory to draw on when the sky darkens, because many of them have never in their lives seen the desert flood. To retrofit an entire city with the drainage and the flood defenses and the relocated neighborhoods that a wet climate demands is enormously expensive and slow, a generational project, and it is being demanded suddenly of places that never planned for it and often cannot afford it, many of them ringed by informal settlements clinging to the very slopes and ravines that the debris flows come down. The mismatch is total. Centuries of building for perfect dryness cannot be undone in the few years the changing climate is giving them, and so the cities remain, for now, almost as exposed to the next deluge as they were to the last. And there is an economic dimension to all of this that raises the stakes far beyond the cities themselves, because of why these settlements exist at all. The Atacama is not populated by accident. It is populated because it is one of the great mineral treasuries of the world, the heart of a copper industry that supplies an enormous share of the metal the entire planet depends on. Its desert floor, studded with vast mines, some of the largest on Earth, and threaded with the roads and railways and ports and power lines that carry the ore out to the world. All of that infrastructure sits in the same desert, exposed to the same rare rains, built with the same assumption of perfect dryness. When the deluges come, they do not only bury neighborhoods. They cut the highways that the mines depend on, wash out rail lines, flood open pits, sever the arteries of an industry that matters to the global economy, so that a storm in a desert most people could not find on a map can ripple outward into the price and supply of a metal used in every wire and motor in the world. And there is a more sinister danger woven into the mining landscape. Because the industry leaves behind great impoundments of waste, tailings held back by dams of their own, and heavy rain on terrain that cannot absorb it, is exactly the kind of stress those structures were often not built to withstand, raising the specter of toxic floods on top of muddy ones. The vulnerability of the Atacama, in other words, is not a local problem confined to a few desert towns. It is a vulnerability threaded through a piece of the world's industrial foundation, and the same rain that buries a neighborhood can also reach through the long supply chains of copper into economies on the far side of the planet. There is a particular strangeness to the human experience of this, a surreal quality that sets it apart from other disasters. Imagine living your whole life in a place where rain is a rumor, a thing that happens in other countries, in movies, in stories, something you have perhaps never actually witnessed. Imagine children who have never owned a raincoat, never splashed in a puddle, never seen their street wet, for whom the very concept of falling water is an abstraction. Imagine a city with no umbrellas, no rain boots, no habit of watching the sky with worry, because the sky has never once betrayed them. And then imagine the day it does. The day the impossible happens and the water comes down. First as a novelty, a marvel, people stepping outside to feel the strange drops, and then as a terror. As the ravines fill and the mud begins to move, and the marvel becomes a wall of debris coming through the neighborhood. To drown in a desert, to be buried in mud in the driest place on earth, is a death so contrary to everything the place is that the mind rebels against it even as it happens. And that disbelief is itself part of the danger. Because people who have never seen a flood do not flee one in time, do not recognize the rising water as a threat until it is too late, do not have in their bones the ancient wariness that people in wetlands absorb from childhood. The very rarity that makes the event so shocking is what makes it so lethal, catching people not only unprepared in their infrastructure, but unprepared in their instincts, unable to believe, until the mud is at the door, that rain could ever hurt them. Watch what is happening right now, in this very season, and you can see every part of this pattern playing out at once. Heavy rains have swept across the northern deserts of Chile, and the response has been the language of emergency on a large scale. States of catastrophe declared over whole regions, towns cut off as the roads that are their only lifelines wash out or vanish under mud. Tens of thousands of people isolated by water in the driest place on the planet. Rivers and ravines that spend almost all of their existence as dry lines on the map have filled and moved. Mud flows have come down through communities, and the machinery of disaster response, the evacuations and the shelters and the pleas for people to leave the low ground, has been thrown into a landscape that spends the overwhelming majority of its time worrying about the opposite problem, about drought and water scarcity, and the management of a resource there is never enough of. And one of the hardest things in these moments is the warning itself, because the flows move so fast and often begin with rain falling high in the mountains, out of sight of the towns below, that by the time anyone in the settlement sees the water, it is nearly upon them. A city can be under a clear sky, its people going about an ordinary day, while miles away and thousands of feet up, the rain that will destroy a neighborhood is already falling and already gathering into the flow that will arrive without much notice through a ravine everyone believed was safe. To warn people in time requires watching the mountains they cannot see and believing in a threat they have never experienced. And both of those are hard, which is why these events, again and again, catch people unready even when the science says they are coming. The current disaster is not a departure from the story. It is the story, happening now. Another chapter in the desert's dangerous education in rain. So step back and see the whole shape of it, because it carries a lesson that reaches far beyond one desert and one country. We tend to think of climate change in simple terms, the wet places getting wetter, the dry places getting drier, a straightforward intensification of what already is. But the Atacama tells a stranger and more unsettling story, because here a dry place is not simply getting drier. It is getting, on rare and growing occasions, catastrophically wet, receiving the kind of rain it is least equipped in all the world to handle, in a place built entirely on the promise that such rain would never fall. The danger is not only in the changing averages, but in the breaking of the certainties, the failure of the assumptions that whole cities and cultures were built upon. The people of the Atacama did nothing wrong by their own lights. They built sensibly for the world they knew, a world of absolute dryness, and that world is being pulled out from under them, replaced by one in which the sky can open without warning and send the mountains down through their streets as mud. And they are not alone in this, because all over the planet there are places built on the assumption that some particular thing would never happen. The river would never rise that high. The coast would never flood that far. The rain would never fall in the desert. And one by one, those assumptions are being tested and broken by a climate that no longer respects the old boundaries. The Atacama is simply among the starkest examples, the driest place on earth learning to drown, its cities buried by the one thing they were certain could never come. Stand then in a street in the Atacama after the mud is past, and look at what it leaves behind. A neighborhood coated in a thick brown sludge that is already hardening in the desert sun, drying back into the stone it was an hour ago. Cars stacked against buildings where the flow left them. Homes filled to the windows with debris. The ancient gravel of the mountains come down at last to reclaim the fan it built. And a sky above that is already clearing, returning to the empty blue certainty it wore for all the years before, as if nothing had happened, as if the water had never come. That returning blue is the cruelest thing of all, because it lies. It promises the old dryness, the old safety, the old certainty that made people build here in the first place, and it hides the fact that the promise is broken, that the rain will come again, sooner now than before, to the same ravines and the same fans and the same streets, to a people who still, in their bones, cannot quite believe that in the driest place on earth, the thing most likely to kill them is water. The mudslides are burying cities that have never seen rain like this before, and the hardest truth, the one drying into the mud along with everything else, is that they are going to see it again.